Last week we looked at the first half of Habakkuk in the prophet's argument with God. Habakkuk came and complained to God of all of the injustice that was going on in the nation of Judah, and God responded with a prophecy that God was going to use the nation of Babylon to punish the unjust in Judah. And Habakkuk responded by saying, I don't like that. And one of the interesting things is God gives a response, but it is not a response of explaining himself to Habakkuk. God doesn't really explain himself to those who complain to him. Instead, God gave Habakkuk and his generation two choices. They can pick one of two directions to go in their lives. They can either dive into personal pride and alcohol and live for self, or instead they can place their faith in God. Now, based on the second half of Habakkuk, the prophet chose to place his faith in God instead of the sins of the world. And how do we know that? Well, in response to God's words, Habakkuk wrote two songs which make up the second half of this book. The first song is a taunt song, taunting those who choose the way of drink and the way of pride and the way of violence. And then a second song is a psalm, which is for those who choose to trust in the Lord. So what we see through these songs is that what Habakkuk has done is he has internalized the message of the Lord for himself, and then he has proclaimed that message through song about how people should live in times of injustice and trials. And basically it all comes down to we can either do one thing when life gets difficult. We can either place our faith in God or we can place our faith in the world. And so it begins with a song of mockery. This song of mockery is broken up into 5 woes for those who will choose to remain in their sins. It is woe to those who dive into sin, because in the end you will have no satisfaction. So our first woe is in Habakkuk 2, verses 6 through 8. Will not all of these take up a taunt song against him, even mockery and insinuations against him, and say, woe to him who increases what is not his? For how long and makes himself rich with loans? Will not your creditors rise up suddenly, and those who collect from you awaken? Indeed, you will become plunder for them, because you have looted many nations. All the remainders of the people will loot you, because of human bloodshed and violence done to the land, to the town, and all its inhabitants. Now, I got to say, all of these woes that Habakkuk brings out, they don't always translate very well into the 21st century world, because culture has changed a lot from Habakkuk's time unto our own. But the first of these woes strikes really hard and really close to home where we're living right now in America, and that is, woe to those who trust in debt in order to live well. So woe to those who gain riches as a result of loans and riches that have not been earned. This is those who trust in debt-based living. They will never have true satisfaction because they're always basically living with this weight around their neck. And that weight is, one day, your debt's going to catch up on you. One day, those debtors will come and take from you what you have borrowed from them and have been unable to repay. And with our ever-mounting debt in America, it appears both personally and nationally, we are just living out woe number one. America appears to be strong and stable, but with each passing year, we are just adding more debt onto our nation, onto our households. We're kind of like, as a nation and family, we're adding sand to the foundations of our lifestyles with debt, with the more and more that we borrow each passing year. And then woe number 2 is verses 9 through 11. Woe to him who gets evil gain for his house, to put his nest on high, to be delivered from the hand of calamity. You devised a shameful thing for your house by cutting off many people. So you are sinning against yourself. Surely the stone will cry out from the wall, and the rafter will answer it from the framework. So the second woe is woe to those who trust in evil or unjust gain. This would be probably the most common use in that time period would have been the merchant who gains his wealth by manipulating or deceiving those that he does business with. So this is a person who piles up wealth based on dishonesty. They may feel like they are like an eagle, sitting up high in the mountains on the eagle's nest. Who can touch them? Who can bring them down? But in the end, their unjust tactics will be exposed, and it will result in shame for them and their house. I think one of the interesting things is that Habakkuk is saying is that the person who trusts an unjust gain, the person that they will harm the most because of their evil and wicked gains, will end up being themselves. They will be damaged by their practices more than anyone else. Verse 11 tells us that the very stones of the city itself will cry out against those who use unjust means to gain wealth. And we can think of multiple stories today of people who used unjust gains in order to make themselves wealthy. We have famous individuals like Bernie Madoff, probably the most famous one with his pyramid scheme. We also have Elizabeth Holmes. Elizabeth Holmes was, just a few short years ago, Forbes named her the richest self-made woman in the entire world. The company that Miss Holmes made was worth an estimated $4.5 billion. Her health tech company was seen as what was going to revolutionize the health industry, and then it turned out that it wasn't going to revolutionize anything because the company was built on lies. None of the things that she said her company would be able to do, it could do, and it was all built upon fraud, and she ended up being convicted on multiple accounts of fraud earlier this year, and she's awaiting her sentence, which will end up leaving her penniless, and their experts are guessing she's going to get 5 to 10 years in prison for executing this fraud, which 5 to 10 years, a $4.5 billion scheme plan, she's getting off pretty light, I think. The third woe is verses 12 through 14. Woe to him who builds a city with bloodshed and founds a town with violence. Is it not indeed from the Lord of hosts that people toil for fire and nations grow weary for nothing? For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. The third woe is against those who depend upon violence in order to gain wealth. This is probably the one that's the hardest to translate into our 21st century world, because what Habakkuk is thinking of in his culture is getting a big group of men together from your village and then going to a nearby village and attacking them and stealing all their grain and some of their women and then bringing their food and their women back to be slaves in your village in order to enrich yourself through that kind of violence. That's what Habakkuk is thinking of here. We don't really have that type of violence in our world today. Probably the closest today would be gang violence, or maybe those who would hold up people who are traveling at gunpoint and stealing their cash and cars. Carjackers would probably be maybe the best equivalent in our area. But verse 14 gives us the one positive note in the midst of this song of woe, and it's a note that is, we could look at it as positive, but if you're the evildoer who he's taunting, you're not going to look at it as positive. And that is that all the earth is filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord. So that means no matter what happens in this world, the Lord knows about it. He's aware of it, and it is important to him. So this is a comfort to one who is being attacked by these individuals. God knows what's happening to you. God knows how you are being abused and taken advantage of, and it matters to him, and he wants to bring justice to you. But this is really a threat to those who are attacking, and that is, God knows what you're doing. He sees it. You're not doing it under the cover of darkness, and justice will one day come upon you. And then our fourth woe is in verses 15 through 17. Woe to you who make your neighbors drink, who mix in your venom even to make them drunk, so as to look at their nakedness. You will be filled with disgrace rather than honor. Now you yourself drink and expose your own nakedness. The cup of the Lord's right hand will come around to you, and utter disgrace will come upon your glory. For the violence done to Lebanon will overwhelm you, and the devastation of its beasts by which you will be terrified. Because of human bloodshed and violence done to the land, to the town, and all its inhabitants. So the fourth woe is the woe of drunkenness, but not drunkenness in the way that we might initially think about it. This is those who use drink and other drugs in order to intoxicate people, to get them in a state so that you can take advantage of them. So this is the idea of, I'm going to get you so drunk, I'm going to use other, it says venom in the text, but other means in order to a way to get someone into a diminished mental state so that you can take advantage of them and abuse them in their intoxicated state. So today this would be the man who takes advantage of a woman by getting her drunk beyond reason, slipping something into her drink so that he can then use her however he would want to. And God says that those who abuse people through drunken violence, through violence upon people who are in an inebriated state, one day violence will overcome you, and you will be disgraced, and you will be shamed for what you have done to others. And then the fifth and final woe is in verses 18 through 20. What profit is the idol when its maker has carved it, or an image a teacher of falsehood? For its maker trusts in his own handiwork when he fashions speechless idols. Woe to him who says to a piece of wood, awake, to a mute stone, arise. And that is your teacher? Behold, it is overlaid with gold and silver, and there is no breath at all inside it. But the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth be silenced before him. The final woe is against idolatry, and this is actually a rather standard Jewish prophet form of mockery, and this is the idea of, you went and chopped a tree down, and you fashioned that tree, or you carved out a piece of stone, and you had to fashion that stone. The stone couldn't make itself into that shape. The piece of wood couldn't make itself into that shape. It can't walk around. It can't even breathe. So what do you think this idol is going to do for you? Nothing. Woe to you who trust in your idols. And it's sort of interesting, I was thinking about it, contrasting this ancient idolatry with what has replaced it in our modern era. And I would say what has replaced idolatry in our modern era is atheism. That is the new religion of those who mock and deride our faith. And we have atheism, Darwinism, and one of the ironic things is, just like idolatry, what can that do for someone? Nothing, because those idols can't do anything. What can atheism do for a person today? Nothing. I mean, they don't believe in any God, so there's nothing for them at all. The world has basically traded one false, unhelpful faith, and that is the faith of polytheism and many gods, for a new, unhelpful faith that can't do anything for you, and that is the faith of atheism. I think probably the only difference is that in Habakkuk's day, you thought your idol could do something for you, and in our day, the atheist knows that he's got no hope, but oddly enough, he, for some reason, takes comfort in the fact that he has no hope. But verse 20 reminds us that we do not place our hope in wood or gold, but we place our hope in the God of heaven. Our God is not a God who has been fashioned by man. Our God is not a God who comes up with theories based upon scientific studies that we'll never know are true or not. But our God is the creator of heaven and earth, and one day he will come and reign over his creation, and all will be silent before his glory. So after the Lord had told Habakkuk in his message that Habakkuk, woe to the person who gets drunk, woe to the person who abuses alcohol, woe to the person who trusts in their own pride, Habakkuk takes that message and then turns it into a lengthy song. And that song is taunting those who trust in debt, unjust gains, violence, drunkenness, and idolatry. And he's saying none of those things will bring you satisfaction. None of those things will bring you the good life that you hope. They will all end in death and loss and emptiness. And then after that song, he then transitions into chapter 3. And chapter 3 gives us Habakkuk's second song, and this is the song for those who put their faith in the Lord. And let's look at the introduction to Habakkuk 3 in verses 1 and 2. A prayer of Habakkuk the prophet, according to Shigionoth. Lord, I have heard the report about you, and I fear. O Lord, revive your work in the midst of the years. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. I think there's a decent amount of ground that's covered in these first two verses. The first thing that Habakkuk does is he introduces the style of music for this song. And this song is to be played according to the style of Shigionoth. And we have no idea what the style of Shigionoth is. That word is something that we have lost in history. So our best guess is this is a type of rhythm that was intended to be played while the song was being sung. Maybe something that's kind of a little bit off cadence is the best guess. But this is just telling us this is supposed to have a specific type of music in the background when you sing through Habakkuk chapter 3. So Habakkuk 3 is definitely a song that is meant to be sung. And the purpose of this song is to help us fear the Lord. It is to help us meditate on the majesty of God, and that in God's wrath when he comes, he will remember mercy to those who rest upon him. And the whole idea behind Habakkuk chapter 3 is something I've stated in here before in a couple of different messages, and that is the fear of the Lord is the only thing that can drive away the fear of man. If you want to escape your worries and your fears over tomorrow, you need to look to the Lord today. You need to meditate on his majesty and his greatness. And when you fear the Lord for everything that he is, for everything that he can do, for everything that he has done, what you end up discovering once you're focused upon God is that all the other things in this world that you might have feared before, they don't hold a candle to the greatness and the majesty of God. And so Habakkuk is coming here showing us how he has placed his focus on the Lord. And so that he can see that even when God's wrath is coming upon his people, what will always come with God's wrath, and that is God's mercy. So what I believe happens in the book of Habakkuk is that the Lord comes to Habakkuk with his response to Habakkuk's complaints of, my nation is so unjust, and the Babylonians who are coming are even worse. What am I to do about this? And God comes to Habakkuk, and God says, Habakkuk, the righteous will live by faith. And so Habakkuk's like, all right, I gotta live by faith. And so what he does then is he starts growing his faith by meditating on the God he needs to place his faith in. And if you're going to meditate on the Lord, and if you're going to go and spend your days dwelling upon him, what should you be looking to in order to know God more? Well, in Habakkuk's day, what he would have meditated on would have been the first books of the Old Testament. Probably Genesis through Joshua, I would guess, based upon the material that's here in the book of Habakkuk. So Habakkuk goes and then wants to put his faith, live by his faith, so then he goes and meditates on the stories of God in Genesis, in Exodus, in Numbers, in Joshua, and dwells upon what God has done for his people in the past. And then after dwelling upon God, he is then able to compose a poetic song in verses 3 through 15 that is retelling the mighty deeds of God that are found in the Pentateuch, in the law. But Habakkuk just doesn't give a straight retelling. He uses a very, I'd say, a sanctified imagination to imagine what it would be like if God, who came and delivered the Egyptians from Egypt, were also coming to him. So there's a mixture of images in Habakkuk chapter 3 where we can look at some things and say, oh, we can see that this was God parting the Red Sea, or we can see that this is what God did in Midian, and there's other places where we'll look at the imagery and we'll be like, I don't see this anywhere, because this is Habakkuk imagining his God coming to him in his day. So this is Habakkuk's poetic picture of what it is to put his faith on the Lord. So I'm just going to read through this song in verses 3 through 15 of Habakkuk. God comes in Teman, from Teman, and from the Holy One from Mount Paran. Selah. His splendor covers the heavens, and the earth is full of his praise. His radiance is like the sunlight. He has rays flashing from his hand, and there is the hiding of his power. Before him goes pestilence, and plague comes after him. He stood and surveyed the earth. He looked and startled the nations. Yes, the perpetual mountains were shattered. The ancient hills collapsed. His ways are everlasting. I saw the tents of Cushan under distress. The tent curtains of the land of Midian were trembling. Did the Lord rage against the rivers? Or was your anger against the rivers? Or was your wrath against the sea that you rode on your horses, on your chariots of salvation? Your bow was made bare. The rods of chastisement were sworn. Selah. You cleaved the earth with rivers. The mountains saw you and quaked. The downpour of water swept by. The deep uttered forth its voice. It lifted high its hands. Sun and moon stood in their places. They went away at the light of your arrows, at the radiance of your gleaming spear. In indignation you marched through the earth. In anger you trampled the nations. You went forth for the salvation of your people, for the salvation of your anointed. You struck the head of the house of evil, to lay him open from thigh to neck. Selah. You pierced with his own spears the head of his throngs. They stormed in to scatter us. Their exaltation was like those who devour the oppressed secret. You trampled on the sea with your horses, on the surge of many waters. Now, what I would like to do in a passage like this is I'd like to walk through it phrase by phrase, verse by verse, and point out all the stories in the first 5 books of the Bible that are then referenced in Habakkuk chapter 3, and then have discussions about how verses 3 and 4 is a poetic condensed retelling of Genesis 1 and 2, talk about how God's splendor covering the heavens might be him speaking the heavens into existence, or what does it mean that God's power is hiding in creation since he is the creator. And we could do a sort of technical examination of all of these verses, comparing them with Old Testament passages. But I think if you have that type of examination of Habakkuk 3, I think you kind of miss the point. Because Habakkuk 3, I don't think is a text that's meant to be examined, but this is a song that is meant to be sung. The point of this chapter is that it's to strike us in our hearts. This chapter is meant to move our emotions and to change our mindset. So the purpose of this chapter is to get you into this imagination mindset so that you can picture in your own mind what it will be like when Jesus comes down from the clouds and in his splendor establishes his kingdom to bring salvation for those who will rest upon him. Have you ever had a time when it's at evening and the sun's setting through the clouds and the whole sky kind of looks like it's on fire? It's bursting with orange and reds, and you see the layers of clouds in the midst of all of that kind of burning sky with the sun setting. And this is something that I have done on many occasions, is look at that burning sky and just imagine what it would look like if in the midst of that, Jesus came bursting through those clouds, coming through that orange and red with his wondrous power to take what is rightfully his. A king riding on a white horse, leading a heavenly host that are following him in the skies, arrayed in battle formation. If you've never done that on a sunset day and imagined what that would look like, I'd encourage you to give it a try and picture Christ coming. Because I think that is what Habakkuk is doing here. I think Habakkuk is sitting in awe and just imagining with this song what it would be like if God came down in this moment in his power and his majesty. And then when Habakkuk thought about the greatness of God, Habakkuk's next thought was, I think I can handle what's going on today. I don't think I need to worry about what's going to happen tomorrow because I can rest in what my God is able to do. And that's the whole purpose of Habakkuk chapter 3. Habakkuk 3 is not here for us to play, can you guess what other Old Testament story is referenced in this phrase? But it's to sit back and wonder at the God who made the sun and the moon. And so when God himself comes, the sun and the moon will stand in awe at his coming. It's not to read about the sun and moon standing still and then saying, oh yeah, there was a story about this in Joshua. I mean, that story in Joshua was amazing. It's how God enabled the sun to stand still when you think of the earth moving and everything. It's incredible. But the point of this is to think not about that story per se, but to think that our God is so incredible that before his majesty, the sun is nothing but this little ball of burning gas. And that ball of burning power would chill and dim before the greater brightness and glory of the holiness of Yahweh. You see, Habakkuk chapter 3, I found this to be one of the more frustrating passages in the Bible. Frustrating because I spent so much time going through every phrase, every verse, and trying to say, I think this phrase is referencing this story, and this verse is about this passage, and trying to draw lines to all the different places that Habakkuk references in the Old Testament. And there's some of the phrases where you're like, this doesn't reference anything anywhere. But the song's not meant to do that. Habakkuk didn't write this so that we can play this game to say what things he's referencing in the Old Testament. But the purpose of this song is to inspire beauty and dread. I would say dread in a good way. Dread in a way where we fear God because of the majesty and the power he has before all. It's to draw us to a place where we fear and trust in the Lord more than we fear and trust in the world. This is Habakkuk coming to the place where Habakkuk says, I fear the Lord more than I fear the coming Babylonians. And once we fear God, we realize we don't need to fear the world, even when things in the world are about as dire as they possibly can be. And that's what we get at the end of Habakkuk. I heard, and my inward parts trembled. At the sound, my lips quivered. Decay enters my bone, and in my place I tremble, because I must wait quietly for the day of distress, for the people to arrive who will invade us. Though the fig tree should not blossom, and there be no fruit on the vines, though the yield of the olive should fail, and the fields produce no food, though the flock should be cut off from the fold, and there be no cattle in the stalls, yet I will exalt in the Lord. I will rejoice in the God of my salvation. The Lord God is my strength, and he has made my feet like hinds' feet, and he makes me walk on my high places. For the choir director on stringed instruments. To me, the conclusion of Habakkuk should rest in the greatest heights of Hebrew poetry. We should love the end of Habakkuk 3 just as much as we love Psalm 1 or Psalm 23 or Psalm 119. Habakkuk, at the beginning of this conclusion, he comes and confesses his emotions. And immediately instantly we might think, oh, when Habakkuk's talking about trembling, maybe he's talking about trembling before the Lord. But that's not what he's talking about. He's talking about awaiting the coming Babylonian forces. It's about those who will invade us. And Habakkuk is saying, I know that Nebuchadnezzar is coming. I know the Babylonians are on their way and they've set their sights on Jerusalem, and it does not make Habakkuk feel good. It causes him to tremble. It makes his body feel like it is falling away in decay as he awaits the day of distress when the Chaldeans will invade. I mean, imagine if you were in those years before World War II began and you had a prophecy of knowing what was going to happen during the days of that war. It would cause you to tremble. It would cause you to fear. And Habakkuk's saying, that's what's happening to me now. I have a terrible, awful feeling because I know what Jerusalem's going to endure when Nebuchadnezzar arrives. But at the same time, what does Habakkuk also know? Habakkuk has also dwelt on the Lord. He's not standing on the rampart anymore, pouting in confusion and anger like he was at the beginning of chapter 2. He now can wait in peace. And the level of his peace is just outstanding and unbelievable. Because Habakkuk is able to say, though the fig tree should not blossom, and there be no fruit on the vines, though the yield of the olive should fail, and the fields produce no food, though the flock should be cut off from the fold, and there be no cattle in the stalls, he's still going to rejoice in the Lord. And it might seem weird to us that Habakkuk is trembling about the Babylonians coming, but then what does he write about in these verses? He writes about famine. He writes about no figs in the fig tree, being cut off from the animals. And we need to remember that while that might sound weird to us, when a foreign army would invade in the days of Habakkuk, the first impact that a nation would have from the invasion of a foreign army would not be the impact of sword and fire and violence from that invading army, but the first impact that they would have would be famine. Because when a big army like the Assyrians, the Babylonians would come into a land, everybody would all do the same thing. All the people who are living on their farmlands and their pastures and raising their animals, they would all run to the same place. They'd go to the nearest city, they'd go hide behind those walls, they'd take all the food into those city walls as they could in order to survive the time period of the attack and the assault on the city. But what would inevitably end up happening to all the food in that city? It'd run out. And it usually runs out a lot quicker than people would expect it to run out. And then they have an invading army who is parked on their fields, eating their grains. If any animals didn't make it into the city, they're slaughtering those, and they're eating those. The first thing that you're going to experience from an invading army is going to be famine. It's going to be, I don't have anything to eat. I can't get to clean water anymore. How am I going to survive that? And Habakkuk says that when the Babylonians come and we begin to experience those days of famine, he will exalt in the Lord. He will rejoice in God, and the Lord will be his strength. Why? Because he realizes that his God is even bigger than all of those things that will come upon him. So what Habakkuk ends up doing in Habakkuk chapter 3 is he transitions from dwelling on his circumstances to dwelling on his God. He went from looking around at everything that was surrounding him and saying, this isn't fair, that's not fair, all of life is unfair, to then meditating on the fact that he worships the Creator God. And his God is the one who has spoken all things into existence. And once he dwelt upon God, where Christ is today seated at his right hand, he was able to say, even though invading armies are going to come in, it's going to be okay. That doesn't mean it's going to be easy. That doesn't mean it's going to be simple. That doesn't mean it's going to be a profitable time. It might make him tremble to think about how difficult the coming days will be, but it'll be okay. It'll be good because Habakkuk has the Lord and he knows how awesome his God is. And so we see this sort of wonderful transition in Habakkuk, where Habakkuk goes from yelling at God and complaining at him and pouting and screaming to when he gets to the point where instead of looking at the injustices around him, he instead focuses on who his God is. Habakkuk can then say, even if the injustices get worse, I'm going to be okay because I'm going to continue to focus on the Lord. And that is how the just will live by faith, is that no matter how difficult the circumstances of our lives may be, we continue to look to God and his majesty and his goodness.